school was like any other. Students hustled to class, teachers lectured monotonously, and the dull rhythm of school life droned on. But there was one thing that set Greenwood apart: Room 13. No one liked talking about it, let alone stepping foot inside. The room had been abandoned for decades, yet it was still part of the school's layout. Rumors swirled among the students about why it remained locked. Some said a student went mad during an exam and scratched answers into the desk until her fingers bled. Others whispered about a teacher who disappeared one day, leaving only a bloody handprint on the blackboard. No one knew the truth, but every student felt the unease when passing by Room 13. The setup. As the annual exams approached, anxiety among students hit an all-time high. Exams at Greenwood were notorious for their difficulty, and failure meant repeating the year. For seniors, this was the final hurdle before graduation. Lila, a studious yet skeptical senior, brushed off the supernatural tales about Room 13. She had bigger things to worry about: her grades. She needed a scholarship for college, and failure wasn't an option. She spent her days buried in books and nights chugging coffee to stay awake. A week before exams, the principal, Mr. Graves, made an announcement. Due to unexpected renovations in the main building, the senior exams will take place in the old wing, including Room 13. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Whispers filled the room. Room 13? Are they serious? They can't make us go in there. It's just a room, Lila muttered under her breath, but even she couldn't shake the tingle of unease creeping up her spine. The first exam. The morning of the first exam arrived. Students shuffled nervously into the old wing. The atmosphere was stifling, the air thick with dust and tension. Lila entered Room 13 with a group of classmates. The desks were ancient, their wood scarred with graffiti and deep gouges. The windows were grimy, letting in only a murky light. As the students settled, they noticed something odd. The temperature in the room was unnaturally cold, despite the sweltering summer heat outside. Lila glanced around. The walls seemed darker than they should be, as if they absorbed the light rather than reflected it. "This place gives me the creeps," whispered Sam, a classmate sitting beside her. "Focus on the exam," Lila replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The proctor, Mrs. Whitmore, distributed the test papers. She seemed uneasy herself, her eyes darting around the room. "You have 2 hours. Begin." Lila focused on her paper, determined to ignore the room's unsettling aura. But as the minutes ticked by, strange things began happening. A faint whisper echoed through the room. Lila's head shot up, but no one else seemed to notice. Then came a low creak, as if someone was walking on the old wooden floor. She looked around, but everyone was engrossed in their papers. Halfway through the exam, the fluorescent lights flickered. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, Lila's heart skipped a beat. The blackboard at the front of the room now had words scrawled across it: "Pay for your sins." Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned pale as she quickly erased the message. "Focus on your exams," she stammered. But focus was impossible. The whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to shrink. The air felt suffocating. When the exam finally ended, the students bolted out of the room, their faces pale and sweaty. The discovery. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The message on the blackboard haunted her. What sins? Whose sins? Unable to resist, she began researching the history of Room 13. Her search led her to an old newspaper article from 1985. It detailed a tragedy at Greenwood High. A student named Margaret Hart had taken her own life in Room 13 during an exam. According to the article, she had been accused of cheating and publicly humiliated. Her final words, scribbled on the blackboard, were, "You will all pay." Chills ran down Lila's spine. The blackboard message wasn't just a prank, it was Margaret's curse. The second exam. Despite the unease, exams continued. The next test took place 2 days later, again in Room 13. This time, Lila was hyper-aware of her surroundings. She noticed that the graffiti on her desk looked different. The scratches seemed deeper, forming patterns she hadn't noticed before. As the test began, the whispers returned, louder than before. Lila tried to ignore them, but they grew insistent, forming words. "Help me." Her hands trembled as she gripped her pen. She looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her palm. She looked down to see her pen had snapped, ink oozing onto her hand. But it wasn't just ink. Mixed with it was blood, as if the pen had cut her. Panic set in. Lila raised her hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to leave." "No one leaves during an exam," the proctor replied sternly. The whispers grew deafening. Lila felt the walls closing in, the room growing darker. The air was thick with a metallic scent, like blood. When the exam ended, Lila fled the room, her breath coming in gasps. She knew she couldn't face another test in room 13. The confrontation. Desperate for answers, Lila sought out the oldest teacher at Greenwood, Mr. Benson. He had been teaching since before the tragedy in 1985. "Margaret Hart," she began. "What really happened to her?" Mr. Benson sighed, his face etched with sorrow. "Margaret was a bright student, but she was falsely accused of cheating by a jealous classmate. The teachers didn't believe her. She was humiliated in front of the entire school. The guilt of what happened to her. It's something we all carry." "Is that why room 13 is cursed?" Lila asked. Mr. Benson nodded. "Her anger, her pain, it lingers there. We tried to seal the room, but the curse is stronger than any lock." The final exam. The last exam was the most dreaded, math. As Lila entered room 13 for the final time, she felt a sense of foreboding. The room was colder than ever, and the lights flickered ominously. The exam began, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You must end this." Lila's vision blurred. She saw shadows moving along the walls, forming the outline of a girl. Margaret. The figure pointed at the blackboard, where new words appeared. "Expose the truth." Summoning her courage, Lila stood up. "Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret Hart deserves justice. The school covered up what happened to her. That's why this room is cursed." Mrs. Whitmore's face turned ashen. "Sit down, Lila." "No," Lila said firmly. "Margaret's spirit won't rest until the truth is acknowledged." The room erupted in chaos. Desks shook, the lights exploded, and a deafening scream filled the air. The students ran from the room, but Lila stood her ground. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, Margaret," she said, her voice steady. "You deserved better." The shadowy figure paused, then slowly dissipated. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. The aftermath. The next day, the principal announced that room 13 would be permanently sealed. Margaret's story was finally added to the school's history, her name cleared of any wrongdoing. Lila passed. At Eastwood Academy, exams were more than just a test of knowledge. They were a rite of passage, a grueling tradition feared by every student. But none was feared more than the final exams held in room 9, a room with an ominous reputation. It wasn't the number itself, but the history tied to it that sent shivers down spines. Room 9 had been the epicenter of a tragedy years ago. A strict and unforgiving teacher, Mr. Willard, had collapsed during an exam, clutching his chest, his lifeless body sprawled across the classroom floor. Rumors suggested his spirit never left the room, his obsession with discipline and grading keeping him tethered to the mortal world. Exam season. As the final exams loomed closer, whispers of room 9's curse filled the halls. Tales of students who heard faint scribbling sounds in empty rooms and who felt icy hands brushing their shoulders circulated widely. The staff dismissed these as baseless rumors, but the students knew better. Clara, a diligent but skeptical senior, brushed off the rumors. She prided herself on her rationality and had no patience for ghost stories. "It's just an old room," she would say. "Creaky floors and bad acoustics don't mean it's haunted." Clara's friends, however, weren't as convinced. "What about the grades? Sam, her best friend, whispered nervously one afternoon. "People say Mr. Willard's spirit changes answers on the test. No matter how well you do, your score always drops in room 9. Clara rolled her eyes. "Ghosts don't grade exams, Sam." The first day. When exam week began, Clara's confidence wavered. Stepping into room 9, she immediately noticed the heavy atmosphere. The air was damp, and the room seemed colder than the rest of the school. The ancient wooden desks were scarred with carvings from decades past, and the blackboard bore faint, unreadable chalk marks that refused to fade. The exam proctor, Mrs. Hargrove, was visibly uneasy. She avoided standing near the blackboard and hurried through instructions. "Begin," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Clara focused on her test, but the silence was oppressive. A faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, caught her attention. She glanced around, but the other students were engrossed in their papers. The tapping grew louder, morphing into the unmistakable sound of a pen scratching against paper. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Trying to shake it off, Clara bent over her exam, her pen flying across the page. But as she wrote, her answers began to vanish. Words she had written moments ago faded into the paper, leaving behind blank spaces. She froze. This wasn't normal. Her heart pounded as she rewrote the answers, only for them to disappear again. Desperation crept in, and her once steady hand began to tremble. The tapping stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, Clara felt an inexplicable urge to look at the blackboard. To her horror, words began appearing in chalk, scrawled by an invisible hand. "Finish what you started." Her blood ran cold. Clara looked at Mrs. Hargrove, who was staring at the blackboard with wide eyes. The proctor's lips moved silently as if reciting a prayer, unearthing the past. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The words on the blackboard replayed in her mind. What did they mean? Finish what? Determined to find answers, Clara visited the school library the next morning. She combed through old yearbooks, newspapers, and staff records until she stumbled upon an article about Mr. Willard's death. The headline read, "Teacher dies during exam in room 9. Mysterious circumstances surround death." The article revealed that Mr. Willard had been grading papers obsessively before his death. A few students claimed he had been furious about falsified answers, but never elaborated. The day he died, he had been clutching a red pen, muttering about unfinished work. Clara felt a chill. Could it be that Mr. Willard's spirit was still trying to complete his grading? The second exam. When the second exam came around, Clara prepared herself mentally. She carried a small mirror in her bag, an old trick her grandmother had taught her to repel spirits. "Ghosts don't like seeing themselves," her grandmother had said. The tension in room 9 was palpable as students filed in. This time, Clara chose a seat near the back. She placed the mirror discreetly on her desk, its reflective surface angled toward the blackboard. The exam began, and once again the room filled with faint tapping sounds. Clara's mirror fogged up inexplicably, and faint streaks appeared on its surface as if an invisible finger was writing. She stared at the mirror, holding her breath as words formed. "I see you." Her heart raced. She gripped her pen tightly, determined not to let fear overwhelm her. But then her exam paper began to change. Her handwriting shifted, the neat letters distorting into jagged scribbles. Beside her original answers, new ones appeared. Wrong answers, marked in red ink. Clara's pulse quickened. The red ink. It was identical to the descriptions of Mr. Willard's grading pen. Confronting the spirit after the exam, Clara stayed behind, waiting until the room was empty. She stood before the blackboard, her reflection faintly visible in the dusty surface. "Mr. Willard?" she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. The chalk lifted from the tray, writing furiously, "Justice for the cheater." Clara frowned. What cheater? What happened? The chalk moved again, slower this time. A student cheated. I caught them. They changed their answers. The truth died with me. Clara's mind raced. Was this about the falsified answers mentioned in the article? Was the curse tied to an unresolved injustice? "Tell me who it was," Clara demanded. "I can help you." The chalk trembled, then fell to the floor. The lights flickered, and a final message appeared on the blackboard. "Find the red pen." The red pen. Clara's search led her to the school's storage room, where old supplies and forgotten belongings were kept. Digging through dusty boxes, she found it. A tarnished red pen with dried ink crusting its tip. As she held it, a surge of energy coursed through her. The room seemed to spin, and a vision overtook her. A student sitting at a desk, erasing answers and rewriting them just as Mr. Willard entered. The teacher's face contorted with anger before he clutched his chest and collapsed. When the vision faded, Clara knew what she had to do. Breaking the curse. The next morning, Clara returned to room 9 with the red pen. Standing before the blackboard, she placed the pen on the tray. "Here it is," she said. "The truth is out. Your work is done." The room shuddered. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an almost peaceful silence. The pen disintegrated into dust, and the blackboard wiped itself clean. From that day forward, room 9 became just another classroom. Clara aced her exams, but more importantly, she ensured Mr. Willard's story was told. The curse was gone, but the lesson remained. The truth always comes to light, even from beyond the grave.